Hello, everyone. Thank you for taking your seats. We really appreciate your joining us here today at the concluding event and celebration of the Vandenberg Coalition's first iteration of the Future of Conservative Foreign Policy series. So just a little bit of background on this series. It was created by Dr. Amanda Rothschild, whom you'll have heard in previous episodes, with the intention to respond to calls for the need to develop a new foreign policy paradigm and create an outlet for serious discussions and dialogue, what Senator Arthur Vandenberg referred to as honest candor in practice. The intention, and I hope result, has been serious, informal, and far-reaching conversations about points of agreement, disagreement, and need in the American conservative foreign policy landscape. So for our final episode, we're really pleased to partner with the American Enterprise Institute, which for 85 years has championed American strength, democracy, and entrepreneurial culture. I'd like to now turn to Mackenzie Eaglin, Vandenberg Coalition Advisory Board member and Senior Fellow at AEI, who will give brief remarks on the national security importance of having these tough conversations within our community. Mackenzie has experience working in the House of Representatives, the U.S. Senate, and the Pentagon, and is an expert on defense strategy, defense budgets, and military readiness. So, Mackenzie, please.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to AEI. Welcome to Ambassador Bolton. It's nice to have him back in the building. Although when he was here back then, when we were coworkers, we shared a wall, and I still can't believe you had a cube. Okay, so we're our new space. I always enjoy hearing from the ambassador. I learned so much from him, but he may not know or remember, but when I first started here about 10 years ago, he invited me on a trip to Taiwan, a delegation that he was leading, and I couldn't go. I was pregnant, and it was like late in the game, but I always appreciated the invitation and reaching out to me. So as Carrie mentioned, obviously Mackenzie Eaglin, Senior Fellow here. I'm excited to have this conversation on the future of conservative foreign policy efforts in this century and in the next. And I'll start with a little look back at the historical battle that's been taking place, of course, which is the century-long battle among conservatives as to what our foreign policy ought to be, one that the ambassador knows quite well. Republican-led isolationism in the 1920s and the 1930s was dealt a stunning setback at Pearl Harbor. And the resulting post-war international order assumed continued American leadership in world affairs. But that role has been challenged consistently, both by our adversaries and our own leaders. In the last 75 years, the United States has seen Nixon's realist containment policies, Kennedy's hawkish internationalism, Carter's embarrassed humility, and the conservative but determined hawkish internationalism of Presidents Reagan and Bush. As the shape of our politics and our policies have evolved, so too have our enemies and our adversaries. And so conservatives are asking, is it better to balance power among like-minded nations or to assert always the primacy of our interests in world affairs? Of course, you have to answer what are our interests and what is the extent of our military commitments abroad? And is our foreign policy about protecting our interests, or do we have larger commitments to American values? And since you're all here for this discussion, not to hear me, I don't have to tell you that these answers are not yet clear. And the battle for a conservative foreign policy is yet to produce a strategic victor, which conservative cadres can rally behind. Conversations like the one we're going to have today with leaders like Ambassador Bolton allow this debate to sharpen the minds of our decision makers and our public. At these mystical tales of American international influence, they're elucidated by candid conversations. We come closer to realizing a sustained strategy for U.S. security of great interest for me. Now, we know that Washington has single-party control. Conservatives, so in the meantime, in the wilderness, have an opportunity to build consensus around our foreign policy objectives. With changes potentially later this year in power and the balance of power in Washington, it's important that we settle on and clarify our aims to the American public. The American Enterprise Institute, the Vandenberg Coalition, and these panels like these and discussions are welcome for fostering discussion, debate, and ideas. And I don't seek that we all will, line up in lockstep behind them, but we will have a respectful conversation supporting our values with logic and advancement of peace and security. So American global leadership, in sum, it's still my preferred choice. While nations like Russia and China seek to undermine our mission, conservatives can unite behind a strategy of influence and power that deters adversaries and furthers the cause of freedom. As a lifelong student of history, former ambassador to the United Nations and National Security Advisor to the President, Ambassador Bolton is a powerful conservative voice in international affairs and a longtime friend of AEI. He's here to continue this conversation about the direction of conservative foreign policy, not just for the rest of this administration, but for, like I said, this century and the next. And without any further ado, since you are not here to hear me, Amanda, Ambassador, welcome.
Well, thanks, Ambassador, for being here today, and thanks to all of you for coming out in person for this event. We really appreciate it. As Carrie mentioned, the series on the future of conservative foreign policy has brought together many different leading intellectuals and practitioners to discuss their vision for the future of conservative foreign policy. So I'd like to begin today by asking you, Ambassador, how you define yourself within the movement. Do you see yourself falling into a particular school of thought or camp, and how would you define your vision?
Well, I don't like the kind of bumper sticker identifications that get thrown around. I think national security is a complex business, and because I'm a Burkean conservative, among other things, I try not to draw overly broad conclusions from insufficient data. When I'm pressed to give an answer to the bumper sticker question, I like to say my foreign policy is pro-American. I don't think it helps to try and abstract doctrines that are applicable to 190 plus other countries. I care about the United States. Figure the others can fend for themselves.
Yes, and you previously said, quote, "I've always considered myself a realist, but I also consider myself very profoundly anti-communist. American interests and values in equal measure were and remain implicated in my anti-communism and in my anti-totalitarianism more broadly construed, and I don't see any inconsistency there." But today, certain self-described realists have perhaps accused you of living in a, quote, fantasy world that's not realistic at all, where the United States has unlimited resources, they would argue. So how would you respond to them? Do you still consider yourself a realist?
Sure. Look, you've now pinned me down and identified me as a baby boomer, which I can't escape from, despite being introduced by the conservative youth movement. So I'm happy to be part of that too. But you're obviously shaped by the history that we face, and I do think that we're in the middle of a very incredibly important political debate. Why this series of talks is so important. But the notion that somehow our resources are limited and that necessarily directs our policy one way or another, I just think is false. I mean, just consider history here for a minute. The United States is attacked at Pearl Harbor in World War II, devastating surprise attack. And, because our resources are limited, we not only can't fight a war on two fronts, we can't fight any war at all. We lose World War II. It's really sad that we didn't have the resources. Or let's get back to history. After World War II, it would have been really nice if the United States had the resources to back up the wonderful idea of the Marshall Plan, but we didn't, and the Soviets took over Europe. It's really too bad we didn't have the resources. Or in the 1960s, when John Kennedy said our objective was to land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth by the end of this decade. It's too bad we didn't have the resources to beat the Soviets, and they've now colonized the moon, and things are really in bad shape. Look, the whole point of this of the debate, I think, is to ensure that you've got adequate resources and time and attention to protect American interests, however broad they may be. And I do think in that regard, for the past going on 15 years now, we have not had the adequate political leadership in our country to make the arguments to the American people, to treat them like adults, to explain what the foreign threats are and why we need resources to protect our interests. We've had, to be blunt right now, 3 presidents, including the current one, who don't make that case to the American people. Now, it's not just a matter of asserting it. You've got to prove it to the people. You've got to demonstrate what the threat is. You've got to explain what you need to do to defend against it. And in a world of multiple threats, which is what we face now, that's a complex argument. There are a lot of competing factors on the domestic side, but I think that for far too long we have not had political leaders that are willing to say national security has to have a higher priority in the overall political debate. That we're spending lots of resources to transfer income from one segment of the American population to another that we can use to enhance our national security. Right now, roughly the defense budget is 3.5% of GNP. I hate to say this, but when I was a little boy, defense expenditures were 10% of GNP. Even during the later part of the Cold War in the Reagan administration, before the collapse of communism, they were at 6 to 8%. So that's roughly double or more what we're spending now. It's of a much smaller GNP. So this question of resources, the question of priorities, is open for political debate. I happen to have enormous faith in the character of the American people when they're treated like adults. And I think we've had real-time experience with this just during this administration. When the administration, erroneously in my view, catastrophically strategically, withdrew from Afghanistan, which was a bad overall policy decision and operationally a catastrophe, the American people knew that. They could see it on television. Their reactions were exactly correct. And that's not the reaction of people who are war-weary with endless wars. They looked at that and said, the net of this is going to be to reduce American national security. They understand it. I have more faith in the people long-term, which, by the way, you need for the success of democracy, just while we're on the subject, than I do in the capabilities of our political leadership. And I think we are entering, as we approach the 2024 election, a point where that debate needs to be had, where we need to insist that political leaders debate national security in the proportion of their time closer to what they will expend on it if they become president. Because there's a huge disjunction between the amount of debate on national security, the amount of time a president really spends on it. So, there are a lot of conflicting threats. I've said before, I believe I'll say it here today, China is the existential threat to the United States in the 21st century. There's no doubt about that in my mind, but there are plenty of other threats. And ignoring everything else to worry about China is not only erroneous, it's dangerous. And I'll just close with one example. If you have a small terrorist group that has just enough hard currency to purchase a nuclear weapon from North Korea, which will sell anything to anybody for hard currency, and they've got another couple of nickels to put it on a tramp steamer and sail it into New York Harbor and light it off there, what is the government of the day going to say at that point? Well, it was just New York. And besides, we've got bigger fish to fry somewhere else. We face a range of threats. We've got to walk, chew gum, and do a couple of other things at the same time. I'm fully confident we can do that.
I'd like to get back to this point about walking and chewing gum in just a moment. But first, you seem to be very optimistic about the American people and their views on U.S. leadership abroad. I'm wondering if you are concerned at all about growing isolationism within the party and the inroads it has made with certain sectors of the American population. Why do you think it is having appeal, and what can we do now to promote American leadership?
Well, I don't think isolationism is growing within the party. I think it's always been there, but I think it remains at a relatively low level. I think the bigger threat of isolationism is within the Democratic Party, because there is no national security wing of the Democratic Party anymore. Where's Scoop Jackson? For God's sakes, where's Joe Lieberman? What you can count in Congress on the hands of one figure, the fingers of one hand, how many really strong advocates of national security they are. So the debate on this subject is going to be held within the Republican Party. And I think if you look at I've once counted maybe 20 people who are considering running for president in 2024. The number who take a an approach, roughly similar to a Reaganite peace through strength policy is very, very high, and the numbers who don't are very, very small. Now, that, of course, leaves the question, what about Donald Trump? And my answer to that's very simple. He doesn't have policies. He has neuron reactions that are largely seen through the prism of how it benefits him politically. And I think we'll see more of that over the next 2.5 years, but they don't amount to a policy.
So turning back to walking and chewing gum at the same time, last week, for those of you who have been following our series, we had Elbridge Colby on for an interview who has a slightly different view on how the United States should approach threats abroad. He was asked about your February Wall Street Journal piece in which you criticized the argument that we should focus on China, perhaps at the expense of other regions and threats around the world. And in response, he called you a, quote, dove on China. So I have to ask, Ambassador, are you a dove on China?
My God, they found out. Look, of course not. This is we'll have in the course of any particular period, there are going to be questions about what relative priorities are around the world. And as I said earlier, China is the threat of the 21st century. But if you look right now to our concern over Ukraine, where overwhelmingly on the Republican side, really overwhelmingly across the body politic, people support giving assistance to Ukraine. The fact is that this is not simply a problem with Russia. There is an entente, in my view, between Russia and China. China's got Russia's back on this. I would be willing to bet a small amount of money that Russian financial institutions that are sanctioned by the U.S. and other NATO allies are finding ways through China's opaque financial system to launder their money. I'm sure China would be more than happy to buy any Russian oil and gas that they can't sell on the open market, as are many other countries. I think China has Russia's back, and I think the Chinese expect that Russia would have their back with respect to their designs on Taiwan, South China Sea, and other areas in the Indo-Pacific. In fact, to say, well, you ignore one area to concentrate on another leaves you vulnerable in both areas. So it's a big task. Somehow we managed to do it during the Cold War. We managed to do it during World War II. And I'm absolutely unabashed in saying I do have faith in the American people. Once they're treated like adults, when their political leaders treat them like adults, when they're given the information they need to make up their minds. And I tell you, it's whatever people want to say about the threat from China, which we're late in appreciating, the best bet to make is not to underestimate our capability to respond.
If you were back in the White House today, what would you be doing differently from the Biden administration in approaching that particular threat, the growing Russia-China axis?
Well, I don't think they have any kind of strategic vision at all. I think this is close to a leaderless administration for a lot of reasons. I don't think that's terribly surprising because I don't think that party thinks about international affairs in a coherent way anymore. So, it's what advice would I give? I guess I'd say resign, but they're not. That's one piece. Yet another piece of advice they're not likely to take. And I think in the circumstances that where you don't have people who understand or capable of defining what American interests are, pursuing consistent, sustained policies to protect them, the best you can do from the outside is try and explain that to set the table. We're in an election season now, but particularly to set the table for the 2024 presidential election and give the people what the alternative is. And I think that process is underway.
Ambassador, are you running in 2024?
No. Actually, I'm continuing to pursue what I've done for close to 10 years now, which is try and help candidates to the House and the Senate who believe in a Reaganite, a strong American foreign policy get elected. I think we've got some good people in Congress, but when I first started doing this in the 2014 cycle, I didn't think we had enough. We still don't have enough, and we need more. And I think it's also important for all of us who have been in this for a while to help fix the damage that's been done to the party over the past 5 years. and to try and move past it and move on. And I think that's so. I just think it's better to be completely selfless and say I don't have any ulterior motives. This is all about best interest of the United States, which is what I'm trying to do.
How has the Biden team done in terms of forging partnerships with allies and partners and pursuing burden sharing around the world? This is an argument that folks who might be on the other side of these issues from you have made often, that we need our allies and partners to be doing more and perhaps pull back from Europe in order to create some degree of fear that they could be abandoned if they don't contribute more. How do we get our allies to pull their own weight in the competition with China and Russia?
Yeah, well, I think there's always a lot of work to do in making the alliances effective. So let's take NATO for a start. It's not like we've got a new problem here. Henry Kissinger wrote a book in 1956 called The Troubled Partnership about NATO. So it was troubled in 1956, and it was accurate to say that, and it's troubled today. We have had discussions with NATO for decades about our European friends' unwillingness to spend enough on defense. But a current circumstance, and this goes to this resource question, stems from the conclusion in 1991 that the collapse of the Soviet Union meant that sweetness and light were going to break out around the world. People talked about the end of history and the peace dividend. Our budgets were cut dramatically. European defense budgets were cut dramatically, and it was a big mistake. And we're still making up for that. There's a lot more we can do, but the idea that the current administration does better on alliances than prior administrations is just not accurate. And I'll just take one example there. Their desperate effort to go back into the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. How are we consulting our allies there? How do the Israelis feel about that? How do the Saudis feel about that? How do the Emiratis feel about that? Are they at the conference table? No, they're not. So, alliance management is a difficult, complex problem. I don't think this administration's doing very well. I don't think they've rallied the Europeans. I think Putin's still counting on a number of Europeans to say, isn't this over yet? Can't we turn the page and get back to business as usual? So I don't think there's a monopoly of one party or the other. I think it's absolutely true that we need to make sure we're not subsidizing our allies. That everybody's got to pay their fair share, but that's been a consistent line in American foreign policy for a long time.
What you mentioned the negotiations on a new Iran nuclear deal. What concerns you most about what may be coming from the Biden team on that deal? Well,
the 2015 deal was wretched. It's not just that the Iranians have been violating it, although they have been. The fundamental flaw in the deal was allowing Iran any legitimacy in enriching uranium to begin with. I think it's possible that the Obama administration people didn't really understand what they were negotiating. But the fact is, when you legitimize enriching uranium up to reactor-grade levels, you're permitting them to do 70% of the work necessary to get it to weapons-grade uranium. We don't, when we license American nuclear technology, we insist that countries neither enrich uranium nor reprocess plutonium, and we allow Iran to do that. It's just incredible. So it was a bad deal. The Iranians, I think the evidence is overwhelmingly clear, barely slowed down at all, if any, in their both weapons and ballistic missile programs. It was absolutely the right thing to do to withdraw from the deal. The maximum pressure campaign's major flaw was that it wasn't maximum pressure. And ultimately, and I've had this view for a long time, the only way we're going to stop Iran or North Korea while we're on the subject from getting nuclear weapons is to change the regimes. And if you're not willing to grasp that point, then you're going to be endlessly disappointed. We've tried to negotiate with Iran for decades. We've tried with North Korea. And as time has gone by, they've gotten ever closer to the point where they have deliverable nuclear weapons. The fact is the negotiation route has failed, and we need to face up to that. People were warned that it was going to fail. I spent a lot of time warning people it was going to fail, so have many others, and now unfortunately it's right in front of us, and it's proof of, it's one of my favorite Winston Churchill quotes, it's proof of the confirmed unteachability of mankind. That you say you can stop this problem earlier if you're willing to be firm. Do you want to try and stop it earlier, or do you want to wait until it's the last minute and the risk is really grave? This administration has spent a year giving Iran even more concessions. I think back in Tehran, the Ayatollahs are smacking their foreheads and saying, why didn't we ask for more? Because these guys would have given it to us. And now we're down, ironically, to the last issue, the only thing that apparently stops the administration from going National Guard's designation as a foreign terrorist organization lifted. Well, I mean, good grief. The whole point of these negotiations was that it was to exclude issues other than the nuclear question. And now they've seized on that. I think there will be an incandescent reaction in Congress if they do that. I think the administration has bungled this very badly, and I think it's a bad sign for North Korea and any other rogue state that wants nuclear weapons. The only country in the world that can stop proliferation is the United States. When we fail, the gates are open for much more widespread nuclear and biological and chemical weapons proliferation too.
Turning for a moment to the Western Hemisphere, when you were National Security Advisor, you reasserted the importance of the Monroe Doctrine, the idea that the United States doesn't accept outside interference in our own hemisphere. Are you concerned about the influence of China and Russia in Latin America today?
Yeah, I think it continues to grow. I think the Chinese, in particular, in the Belt and Road Initiative, and the way they've approached countries in Latin America, Africa, and Asia have a very long-term strategy, which we do not, and they've made consistent gains. And the greatest tragedy, of course, is in Venezuela at the moment. But as somebody who invented the phrase "troika of tyranny" once pointed out, you've got Nicaragua and Cuba. I think if one of those regimes fell, it would knock the props out from the other two. I don't think this administration gets that. We know, in fact, that they tried to find a way with the Maduro regime to get them to do something so that we could lift sanctions, mitigate the sanctions to permit U.S. importation of Venezuelan oil because of the effect of the embargo on Russia, which is just catastrophic, as they tried to do with part of their reasoning for the Iran deal. So I think this gives great encouragement to those kinds of forces and external forces from outside the hemisphere that endanger us here.
You mentioned troika of tyranny, turning to...
Here's the author of the phrase. I just said it. She actually wrote it, but that's...
Well, thank you. Turning to another speech you gave, the first speech you gave as National Security Advisor was a condemnation of the International Criminal Court, or ICC, which was an interesting choice for your first public address. Sometimes it seems conservatives aren't paying as close attention to the international organizations as perhaps they should be. Does that concern you at all? What is the conservative approach to foreign policy and multilateral institutions? What should the Biden team be doing? They're taking over the chairmanship of the UN Security Council this month. What would you recommend they do?
Right. Well, this is a good example of the problem of bumper stickers in foreign policy. You know, people say, "Are you a unilateralist? Or are you a multilateralist?" I'm an American. I'm going to propose policies that benefit the United States. Someday they may be unilateralist. Someday they may be multilateral. One of the things that I had the privilege of doing in George W. Bush's administration was negotiating a thing called the Proliferation Security Initiative, which was, and by the time I had left and others had taken over, a very widely subscribed to initiative to stop international trafficking in weapons and materials of mass destruction. It was firmly multilateral. It was not like the UN, for example. One of the British diplomats that was engaged in the discussion, I wish I had thought of this, but anyway, he said, PSI is an activity, not an organization, unlike the United Nations, which is an organization, but not an activity. And I think that's part of the measure of it. It's what's effective, what works for the United States. Sometimes it's going to be the collective defense organization like NATO, sometimes it's going to be acting unilaterally, sometimes it's going to be something else. The International Criminal Court was a different order of magnitude and remains to me when people say, how do you define core U.S. interest? The absolute first element at the core is American sovereignty. That is to say, we make decisions about our future. And sovereignty is not an abstract concept for us. If you listen to the debate among international legal scholars and the real religious multilateralists, they say there's nothing wrong with sharing sovereignty. It's a good thing. Because they treat it as a kind of abstract. So the European Union's big about sharing sovereignty, and they're always generous enough to try and share a little of ours while they're at the project. But for us, sovereignty is very concrete. We know what it is. It's the first three words of the Constitution. It is we the people. We are sovereign. And talking about giving up authority to international institutions, I think is just contrary to the whole spirit of the Constitution. Most Americans of whatever party don't think they have enough control over our own government now. So the notion we're going to make it even more remote and more distant, I don't think makes any sense. And so when you have institutions like the International Criminal Court, which are, have very high-minded objectives, nobody asks questions like, are you bothered by the fact there are no jury trials in the International Criminal Court? That was an issue for us in 1776, jury trials, kind of a quaint notion. Are you at all bothered that the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court is selected by the court? Remember that separation of powers idea? And by the way, where's the rest of this international government that the court fits into? And what about the fact that the court purports to have jurisdiction over the citizens of countries who haven't joined the court? Where did they get that authority? These are the kinds of sovereignty issues that deserve more debate than they get, and I think they really are at the core of a conservative foreign policy.
The Vandenberg Coalition is currently running a working group to prepare future conservative leaders to hit the ground running when they have the opportunity to enter government, to understand the bureaucracy and how to operate within it, because there's such a steep learning curve for most people when they enter government. In a 2007 interview with Adam Garfinkel, you said in regards to wanting to serve in the State Department of all places, quote, "The experience of being a conservative at Yale and other earlier experiences too taught me that you can affect the maximum degree of policy change in perhaps the least likely of environments." So what advice would you give to conservatives at all levels of government, should they have the opportunity to serve perhaps in 2024? We also today have a number of Hill staff here who have been serving in the minority, and perhaps this would be of interest to them as well.
Yeah, well, I think it's very important that people be prepared, if their circumstances permit, to serve in the government and in the executive branch, which particularly in national security is the center of activity for where policies are formulated. And I think it's important to come in with the attitude of trying to understand the nature of the institutions that you're going to populate. The fact is, bureaucracies have cultures. We know this from public economics. They have their own institutional considerations to take into account. It's not because it's a deep state. It's because bureaucracies take on a life of their own. And what I always tried to do, and I learned this through some painful experiences before I learned it, but the more you understand the bureaucracy, not that you agree with it, but the better you understand it, its folkways and byways, the competing cultures within it, the greater your ability to affect policy. And as I've said, I do this not because I want to apply for a membership card in the bureaucracy, because I want a driver's license. And I don't think you get a better way to understand it than by being a part of it. And by learning what the considerations are that you need to affect it. So it may seem like something that's counterintuitive, but you're never going to have a sustained effect on policy, really, unless you help change the culture. Now, believe me, I don't underestimate how difficult it is. I've said the State Department needs a cultural revolution, and it's built up characteristics over decades, and it's going to take a long time to change them.
Before we turn to audience Q&A, perhaps we can end on a hopeful note. This is the last of part one of our series. Is there anything that gives you hope and optimism in terms of the future of our national security and foreign policy?
Yeah, I think we've gone through a period where there just has been inadequate debate on the subject, where the debate has occurred, it's been narrow and personal and partisan. But we are now in a period where the range of threats that we face is far broader, far stronger than we've seen in a long time. We've gone through periods where you could identify kind of one particular struggle. During the Cold War, we knew what we were focused on. During the period of the war against terrorism right after 9/11, that was focused too. You can see that in other periods of history. But today, and increasingly in the rest of the century, the threats are going to go all the way from peer adversaries at the nuclear level right down through the continuing threat of international terrorism. And so in a more complex, less ideologically clear environment, it's going to require a lot more effort. And it goes precisely to the question of whether you appreciate that to defend the American way of life, the system we have here, if we don't take a strong and forward position internationally, nobody else is going to do it for us. No international institution is going to provide us with the protection that we feel we need. And I think leaders who can explain that to the American people are going to get very broad support. So despite the level of threats, which are considerable, I think there's every reason to be very optimistic.
Great. Well, thank you so much. We do want to take questions from the audience, so please raise your hand, and we have folks with mics. Sam, if you want to, Gabe has a question. Yeah.
Thank you, Ambassador, for coming. My name is Gabriel Nerona. I worked on the maximum pressure campaign on Iran at State, and I was at the...
And lived to tell about it.
and lived to tell about it, and thank you for obviously the risks that you have endured as a result of your service. I wanted to ask about two questions which are often associated with you: regime change and American national power. As prelude, I think a lot of people in this room either have hoped for or have worked towards changing regimes, in whether it's Venezuela, Syria, Iran, North Korea. And I think in the last 5 years, we had a great opportunity to do so, but frankly failed on all those accounts. Do you think there's a mismatch between conservatives generally, our ambitions of regime change, and our ability to actually effectuate it? And the follow-up related question is, what can we do holistically as a country to increase our ability down the road to be able to influence countries' economies, countries' decision-making ability, especially as China seems to be thwarting some of those best laid intentions?
Right. Well, I think the point about regime change derives from the conclusion that a particular regime whose behavior we find objectionable is not subject to whether it's persuasion or pressure that actually convinces them to change their behavior in a permanent, sustained way. So, if you look at the Kim family dynasty in North Korea, my view is they want nuclear weapons, not for defensive purposes, but to advance their interest to take control of the Korean Peninsula. They're not going to change their behavior. Because that would mean mean fundamentally renouncing the purpose of the regime. They're prepared to say almost anything, and they have said almost anything, to get relief from economic sanctions, to get American assistance. They've committed to destroy their nuclear weapons program. They've taken down little bits and pieces of it, but they're never going to give it up. And when you get to that point, if you really want to eliminate the threat in Northeast Asia, eliminate the threat of onward proliferation from North Korea, the only conclusion you can draw is that you need a different regime. Now, Korea is actually easy because you don't need a new regime in North Korea. You've got a regime in South Korea that can become the regime for the whole country. Iran is a little bit more difficult, but not impossible. I think the regime there is weaker now than at any time since the 1979 revolution. Why have we not? Venezuela, I could go on for hours about why it was right to try and overthrow the Maduro regime. I have absolutely no regrets about that. My only regret is we didn't succeed, although we came close. And I think the reason is, honestly, within the government, in those cases, we have not fully drawn together all the resources that we've had. You can use a slogan like maximum pressure, but we haven't really applied it, and sometimes it takes more than that. I think this is a lot more doable than people believe, and it's not that you reach for regime change as the very first alternative. You go for it when you recognize behavioral change is not going to take place, and I don't think we should be afraid of that. It's entirely consistent with the approach the United States has taken throughout its history, and it's proven successful. So, there are a lot of different ways to go about it. Regime change is often associated with the direct use of military force. I think that's the exception rather than the rule. But I think that helping others get to the point where they can change the regime themselves is the real objective, and I think it's very doable.
Ambassador Curry.
Thank you, Ambassador Bolton. I want to go back to, thank you. I want to go back to some of the things that you were talking about, and I obviously share your faith in the American people and their judgment, and that they could do a better job than our current administration in terms of setting policies. But I do worry very much about not just the bureaucratic culture, which I've engaged with at the State Department during multiple Republican administrations, but the just sheer failure, incompetence, and the bureaucratic stovepiping, just the problems of how the whole institutions have silted up over time, and how ill-suited they are to the moment that we find ourselves in with the threats that we confront. And as Republicans and as conservatives, how do we attack the problems, the bureaucratic reforms that are needed, whether it's at DOD, state, Treasury, to make sure that the instruments of national power are honed and up to the task?
Yeah, well, I think it really requires starting with an administration that understands the nature of the problem. And I don't want to cause too much turmoil here, but let's just take the Trump administration as an example of an administration that didn't even understand what the problem was. I mean, I think the president sometimes barely knew what the rest of the government looked like. He didn't like to go into the old executive office building. He liked staying in the White House. The government is so vast and has developed over time in so many convoluted ways that, as I said with respect to the State Department, it really does take, it would take a cultural revolution. But that's not to say that it's not possible to do. It requires a president who insists that his cabinet secretaries follow through on it. And it's been a long time since we've had presidents or cabinet secretaries that were willing to do that. Amity Shlaes, in her biography of Calvin Coolidge, tells the story of Calvin Coolidge and his director of the budget office going through ways of cutting the federal budget. And at that time, mail bags were striped, I think I have this right, striped pink and gray. There were pink stripes. And Calvin Coolidge and his budget director focused in on that and said, why are we putting the pink dye in there? And they said, well, no real reason. So they stopped putting pink dye in. They saved $5,000 a year. And that's why mailbags are gray today. And by God, take the present value of $5,000 expanded for 60, 80 years and tell me what the savings would be. We need a Calvin Coolidge kind of president who saves our tax dollars and spends it on defense where we really need it. And we need cabinet secretaries who do the same. You can't do this out of the White House. But I'll tell you, and you may have seen this in your own experience at the State Department, a new Secretary of State comes in, and the Foreign Service, which is the smartest, most adept bureaucracy in Washington, says, oh, Mr. Secretary, oh, Madam Secretary, you have so many heavy responsibilities. You have the weight of the world on your shoulders. All these management issues, we'll take care of them. And most secretaries say, thank God, I don't want to have anything to do with it. And you have the bureaucrats running the bureaucracy, and it tends to be self-perpetuating. You can do a lot. I have utmost respect for the Foreign Service and the Civil Service at the State Department. They're some of the best educated. They are the smartest bureaucracy in Washington. They need leadership, and they need leadership that focuses on American interests. So, I'd reform the Foreign Service Institute. That's the first place I would go. There are a lot of things you can do. This is not impossible. You just have to concentrate on it. And what I would say, and I think I would give Colin Powell a lot of credit for this, he would say, stay in Washington and do your job. Don't travel the world. Plenty of travel you're going to have to do. Stay in Washington and run the Department of State or the Department of Defense or whatever it might be.
Great. I think we have time for a few more questions.
Somebody's waving his hand over there.
Yeah. Oh, Dan Rundy.
Thanks. So I'd like to say I'm on the far right over here, so that's good. Thanks. So thank you. So good. So thanks, Ambassador Bolton. This is great. Thanks for convening this AEI and the Vandenberg Coalition. Thank you, Ambassador Bolton, for setting up the Bolton PAC. I think it's really, really important that we support House and Senate candidates who are internationalists, and so I think it's really, really important what you've done and toiling in the vineyards on that. So thank you very much. Too much of the world of foreign policy, we often think, oh, that political stuff, I don't want to get my hands dirty with it. It's really, really important. So thank you so much. Related to that, we now have a bunch of great leaders in the House and the Senate, partially thanks to organizations like the Bolton PAC, who are emerging Republican leaders in the House and the Senate. God willing, we're going to take control of the House. And God willing, we're going to take control of the Senate. If we take control of both the House and the Senate, there are some things that the Congress can do in line with what we've just been talking about. The thing I'm most struck with by the conversation we've just had is that the Chinese have a national long-term strategy. I agree with you, Ambassador Bolton. I think we need a 20-year, ultimately bipartisan strategy. I don't believe the Democrats are going to provide it. I think it's going to require thoughtful leaders in the Republican Party to provide it and for us to be the party of ideas again. So given that we're going to have this shift in 6 months' time, what are some of the steps the Congress could do to start teeing up that national strategy? Because it's going to take a little while for that to happen.
Yeah, no, I think one of the reasons the elections this fall are so important is that not only to get control of one house to stop the worst excesses of the administration in domestic policy, but to set the table for the 2024 election. And, I'm a partisan of the executive branch and national security. I can't disguise that fact. I know there are a lot of people from the Hill who are probably watching this. But the role of Hill here is twofold. Number one, the most important bicameral responsibility of Congress is appropriations. And I think this is a very important opportunity to reset priorities, to devote more resources to national security, less to wasteful domestic programs, to help tee up what I think we're going to need is a pretty massive across-the-board increase with a Republican president to make up for years of inadequate funding, and that work needs to start now. But also, control gives us the opportunity to begin to familiarize the country as a whole with the debate. Remember when Congress used to hold hearings The authorizing committees would call witnesses up and they'd talk about policies and things like that. They didn't just scream at each other about on personal conflicts. I think in Senate and House, you could envision hearings through all the committees: Foreign Affairs, Armed Services, Intelligence, Homeland Security, that could bring people up to testify who are not well known, but who have done good academic work, who have had real practical experience. Let's get these people out. If there's anybody on the Democratic side that has a thought, invite them to. Have the debate. Get the debate started. We're going to win the debate if we can move it forward. And to have the gavel and to have the potential spotlight in all those committees on both sides of the Hill, I think is a huge opportunity. And there are plenty of people in this room I know who are prepared to help out. It's something we shouldn't ignore.
Well, our executive director, Carrie Filippetti, was going to make some closing remarks, so I think we may have to stop the audience Q&A there. There will be a reception afterwards. It is the Calvin Coolidge model, so we skimped on the yogurt, but there will be Danishes. But Ambassador, thank you so much for being here today. This was wonderful, lively conversation. We appreciate your willingness to get into the big debates with us, so thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
All right, thank you guys so much for being here. Thank you, Ambassador Bolton. Thank you, Amanda. As mentioned, this concludes this first iteration of the Future of Conservative Foreign Policy series. So again, the series really began after discussing with our advisory board, of whom we see many represented in this room, the idea that while there's very clear sense of what constitutes conservative domestic policy, there's not really a clear sense of what qualifies as conservative foreign policy anymore. For our part at Vandenberg, we seek to build a path that, like the one built by Senator Arthur Vandenberg in the middle of the 20th century, charts, quote, the middle ground between those extremists at one end of the line who would cheerfully give America away, and those extremists at the other end of the line who would attempt a total isolation, which has come to be an impossibility. Over the last 3 months, with Amanda, we have explored questions of conservative foreign policy with 7 historians, strategists, and policymakers, learning from each of them what changes should be made to confront the current national security threats and take advantage of the new opportunities born by the 21st century. We've had over 1,000 listeners to this series, but it's not just the goal of our coalition to update conservative foreign policy. We also firmly believe that foreign policy should be developed alongside the American people, not just in the bubble of Washington, D.C. I think we heard that reiterated by Ambassador Bolton and Ambassador Curry, the importance of the American people and their involvement in developing American foreign policy. So that's why when I say this is the end of our first iteration, that means we have a second iteration. And the second iteration of our series, which will come on after a few months of a quick break for Amanda, who's been working very hard on this current series, is to speak with conservative elected officials. So we've been working a lot with strategists, with policymakers, people in administrations. Now we're going to be speaking with governors, senators, and members of Congress, many of whom are going to very strongly disagree with each other, but that's the point of this series. Articulated on foreign policy during this first series are actually implemented and how it's relevant to the American people, not just relevant to policymakers here in Washington. So our coalition exists to highlight those voices who are committed to strong, principled leadership. You'll see that throughout the series, but you will see that there are different pathways to getting there. We look forward to starting that next series in the coming months, and we do invite all of you to join. I don't want to commit to doing them all in person, but I definitely liked this model more than the Zoom ones, so hopefully we'll be able to partner with AEI and others again in the future. So thank you once again for your support of our program. Thanks very much to AEI for this wonderful space and the opportunity to partner with them. Thank you to Ambassador Bolton and our other participants in the series, which you can find on our YouTube channel. So we've spoken with Matt Pottinger, Matt Koenig, Elbridge Colby, Nadia Shadlow, Will Imbeden, Peter Berkowitz, and Colin Dueck. And then I would just like to give a special thanks to Dr. Amanda Rothschild for creating and hosting such an informative series. So I see they're bringing the food out now, so I'm going to stop talking and welcome everybody to the reception. Thank you again so much for your participation in this event.